Today on Locked On Canadiens, which team is having a better or worse rebuild, the Habs or the Sens?
You're Locked On Canadiens, your daily podcast on the Montreal Canadiens, part of the Locked On Podcast Network, your team every day.
Hi there, everyone, and welcome to episode 1057. Today's episode is brought to you by Monopoly Go. I'm going to admit it, I have a competitive side, and it is a big fan of Monopoly Go, the mobile twist on classic Monopoly. So join your friends and download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. My name is Laura Sab, also known as the Active Stick, and I'm joined today by the lovely and talented Maude of Game Over Ottawa. If you haven't heard, the Game Over Network is relaunching, and we want to hear all about it. Maude, thank you so much for joining me today.
Thank you so much for having me. Really excited to be here. Game Over is coming back. We're doing some playoff streams already for the Canadian playoff teams that actually did make it. Unfortunately, of course, today we're going to be discussing our teams, which are not involved in that. But we do have a bit of a relaunch for the playoffs, and then we're going to be back in full swing of things for next season, which is going to be really exciting.
And so for people who have listened to the show for a long time, you'll know about Game Over Montreal, and Game Over Ottawa is no different at all. So how does it work?
Yeah, so very similar setup, of course, for the viewers who may be familiar with Game Over Montreal. Either me or my co-host Charlie, or both of us, instant reaction to Senators games right after they finish, usually going live within like 5 to 10 minutes after that final whistle, just to get the most raw reaction of what we just witnessed, which a lot of the time over the last 2 seasons, it's just been us feeling tortured for having to talk about how these Sens games go, because there's been some doozies in the last 2 years. But every now and then we got some fun times too. So hopefully things will be looking up next year and we'll get to be celebrating some more wins on the show. But you never know with this team.
And I'm so glad that you're on, because we haven't had any Sens content this year at all. And I really did want to talk about the eventful year that they've had. Obviously, it started with change in ownership. Michael Andlauer, noted Habs fan, Michael Andlauer. Actually, when I met him, he was really, really great. But, he purchased the Ottawa Senators. And by all accounts, he's somebody that is really passionate about hockey, passionate about success, passionate about having hockey teams. And then obviously a series of personnel changes have happened. There were a couple of scandals as well, in terms of, a whole gambling thing that he inherited without even knowing about it, apparently. So I wanted to know, from the Sens fan perspective, how has this year been? It feels like a roller coaster. How have you felt as the changes have rolled on over the course of the year?
I think roller coaster is the perfect way to describe it, especially for the first 2 or 3 months of the season when most of those changes were taking place, and of course all the scandals too. And then kind of after that, the roller coaster kind of reached its low point and just kind of slowed down and stopped from around about January on, as we just kind of settled into just watching a hockey team that was confirmed to be bad at that point, because through the whole first couple of months we had the little bit of hope where it was like, okay, we shouldn't be this bad, we'll change our coach and then we'll get on a hot streak with the new coach. It never happened. So roller coaster is a good way to describe it, I think.
So you mentioned the coaching change as well. So there were a lot of changes that it seemed to me as an outside observer that should have been made right off the bat. And I feel like it took a little bit of time for that. Why do you think that is? Or do you think that kind of harmed the direction that they were going in?
I think it might have a little bit. I think the thought process with Andlauer and the new management was sort of that they didn't want to come in and make rash decisions really quickly. I think as a new owner, he didn't want to come in and just change everything right away. He wanted to see how things would play out and give the people who are already in positions as coach and GM, give them sort of one last chance to prove that they deserve to continue in their roles. It didn't exactly play out that way. And, even with the general manager situation as well, it seemed like they didn't really want to necessarily be moving on from Pierre Dorion, but then they were kind of forced to, with what happened with losing a first overall draft pick as well, all of that stuff. So I think it was a lot of caution in terms of not wanting to make rushed decisions, but a lot of the fans didn't really agree with that. We were just ready for changes right away, which was a little bit tough to see through, to sit through that,
Exactly, because you've been living this since, they've been talking about this 5-year rebuild that is now in year 8 or whatever it is. You've been waiting for that moment. And so for them to even take a few months, I think for you feels like, that's the cherry on the top of this, of a terrible, terrible dessert. But in the meantime, there was also kind of a sense that you had a little bit more um, passion in the ownership. Is that just me? I don't know if I'm sensing that. And again, like there were a lot of toxic elements to the previous ownership. There was a lot of, is this a moneymaker? Is this a passion project? And sometimes the two seem to be in conflict. How do you feel about Michael Andlauer now?
I think you're 100% right about that. Like, apart from the caution to make changes, which is the main thing that most fans didn't really like. I think other than that, Andlauer as a person and his passion for hockey as an owner, I think everyone is really pleased with that. Um, just from the fact that the way that he responded to certain things during press conferences, where when we got docked that first round pick, it was he was not happy about that at all. He was kind of sending some shots Gary Bettman's way, and that made a lot of fans happy. Where it's like, okay, he's kind of sticking up for us, even though he can't necessarily get the decision reversed or anything. I liked how passionate he was with his comments on things like that, and he's done a good job endearing himself to the fans as well. I remember, I think it was after the home opener, he watched the game from a box at kind of the top of the 100 section. And then after the game ended, he stayed for quite a while just greeting fans on the way out. Everyone was congratulating him on the purchase of the team, and he was just mingling with fans for a long time. And I think that's awesome to see. And as well, I also really liked his last game with his season tickets in Montreal, where he was on the glass seats, just cheering on for all the Sens goals against his former team. I think that was really endearing as well.
I think that's really funny. And, one of the things about Michael Andlauer that I've always heard and also has been my experience too is that obviously he's an obscenely rich guy, but he is very accessible, right? Like, and that's like I met him when I couldn't get a cab and he offered me a ride in his actual, like the car, right?
Oh wow.
And we had a chat and we talked about the time he was part of the Habs, owning the farm team for the Habs. And so he was part of the Habs front office. And we talked about the draft pick that was, and it was during a draft. And so I always thought of him as a really nice guy because he didn't have to do that. He could have left me waiting another 45 minutes in the middle of summer in Pittsburgh where there were no cabs and there was no Uber at the time. So it was really like one of those things where like he was really nice. And he, like, you could tell, like, he could tell I was a Habs fan, and you could tell that, that was part of the relationship the friendship that he built with that in that moment. And so I feel like he does kind of have his finger on the pulse. Like, I would not be surprised if there's more discussions that he has with fans about how things are going and their opinions. He's probably listening to you on Game Over, watching you on Game Over too. Like, I wouldn't surprise, like, he seems like that kind of guy, right? Like, he really
Mhm.
cares about hockey. But at the same time, like, I think, we should kind of turn ourselves to maybe something a bit more positive before we go into comparing rebuilds and we all get sad again. Was there a certain thing that he did, or maybe his management group did, that changed, sort of gave you a little bit more optimism as we headed towards the end of the season?
Hmm. It's tough to say because, like I was saying, with certain decisions taking a little longer than we expected, I think some of that might also apply to how the trade deadline was handled as well. I think a lot of people were expecting a larger move to be made, maybe involving someone like Jacob Chikrin or something like that. It's been sort of a thing where they're just sort of pushing everything to the off season to decide where they want to go from here. Um, I think in general, people have a lot of trust in the management group that's been put in place so far, but it's gonna be tough to evaluate until we see some big moves, which I'm hoping to see this summer.
Right. And, Habs fans are no stranger to that. There were a lot of people that were disappointed with the Habs trade deadline. And I think there's some people that are, we're way earlier into our rebuild, but there are a lot of question marks about it. Some fans, we're always like in the comments, we're, on the social media, we're hearing about this. Some people are like, we should just be patient. The Habs ownership group does not seem to want to mortgage a contending future for quick wins, which I understand, but people are understandably getting frustrated. So I feel like a good way to kind of talk about our fandom is compare rebuilds, and we will do that here on Locked On Canadiens in just one moment. But first, this episode is brought to you by Indeed. If you're hiring, you need Indeed because if you're drafting your fantasy team, you need to handpick the best stars for your business team. If you're building your talent roster, you need Indeed. And Indeed is so easy to use. It brings every hiring tool together. You can attract, interview, and hire all in one place. And it's so, so good. It's so easy for you to find what you're looking for exactly. And candidates you invite to apply through Instant Match are 3 times more likely to apply to your job than candidates who only see it in a search. Indeed will help you find the best people. It does all the hard hiring work for you. If you sponsor a job, we will match you with quality candidates whose resumes on Indeed fit your job description right when you post. You can start hiring fast. And I know as a hiring manager, it is such a hard thing to do. You really, really need the best partner in hiring. Indeed knows that when you're growing your own business, you have to make every dollar count. That's why with Indeed, you only pay for quality applications that match your must-have job requirements. Visit Indeed.com/locked on to start hiring now. Just go to Indeed.com/locked on. Indeed.com/locked on. Terms and conditions apply. Cost per application pricing not available for everyone. All right, we are back with the wonderful Maude Shoblocher from Game Over Ottawa, and we are about to compare rebuilds. Like we were going to get really, really miserable. We started out talking about chaos. Now we're going to get into some misery. But I think one of the things that Habs fans have been doing is hedging. I don't want to say hedging their bets, but they're trying to constantly reassure themselves that this is going somewhere. And I think on nights when the Montreal Canadiens play terribly against a terrible team and then lose, or get absolutely shellacked by a team that they don't like. Ottawa's done that a few times this year to the Habs. People kind of fall into despair a little bit. Like it's every single loss the next day in the comments we'll see a lot of despair. But I feel like as a Canadiens fan, objectively, at the end of the season, when you're listening to that press conference, you're listening and you're kind of considering where they are in their rebuild, when you're trying to gain some perspective, it's really, really actually in a good place right now because they're still very early in the rebuild. They still have a top 10 draft pick. The management is very vocal about not mortgaging a future for quick wins. Whereas in Ottawa, it's a little bit different because there was supposed to be a rebuild. And then there were a lot of bold moves, but they weren't necessarily the right moves, right? They didn't really amount to what fans wanted to see. So I was kind of curious what your experience of the 5-year rebuild has been.
So you're 100% correct about those bold moves not working out, because I think one of the biggest problems with where our rebuild is at right now is that Pierre Dorion sold off 2 high first round picks for Alex DeBrincat and Jacob Chychrun, and neither of those acquisitions have actually worked out. We may end up seeing Chychrun sign an extension this summer. We may not. So there is time for that move to turn around yet. But DeBrincat, obviously, that bridge that's sailed, right? Like that's over and done with, and it was a bad return when we had to sell him on. So what it's resulted in is just our top prospects are already on this team, and we don't really have any other top prospects coming up other than like a few sort of, you would probably call them like B and C level prospects, guys who can be contributors in sort of the bottom of the lineup or the middle of the lineup, but not really guys that I see coming up for the Habs like Lane Hudson. We don't have anyone like that at this point.
You're
So
now my favorite person because you brought up Lane Hudson. We love
yeah.
Lane Hudson on this show. Say Cole Caulfield and Nick Suzuki, and then it's over for everyone else. You will be my best friend.
Yeah, I think you can easily compare how the Habs have Caulfield, Suzuki, and Slavkovsky like at the top of the lineup right now. It's similar to a few seasons ago with the Sens, where they just threw in Brady Tkachuk, Josh Norris, and Drake Batherson, and that was the new first line. And 2 of them were rookies at the time. I think that was like in the Canadian division season. Back then, it was like, okay, we're just throwing them to the wolves, and we didn't necessarily have like good veteran support behind them. It was just like, all right, the kids are going out there and they're gonna figure it out on the fly. It worked in the sense that those guys are pretty good point producers now, but we're seeing that overall as a team, they don't really have that two-way game. And we're searching for yet another coach at this point to try to figure out how to get them to play the right way. So I don't know. One thing I'd like to ask you is, do you think that the Habs have the right veteran support for all their young guys coming up? Because that's something that I feel like was really missing for the Sens in their rebuild. Was there was a couple good veterans, like Connor Brown was pretty good, but I mean, you see that he hasn't exactly been as good after leaving. We just had a bunch of guys that really couldn't carry their weight, and then
Mhm.
everything was all up to the young kids. Like, how do you feel about the Habs from that perspective?
That's a really fantastic question. I actually really love it because there's some players right now that will be veterans when the Habs are contending. So somebody like Samuel Montembeault, right now he is
Yeah.
the undisputed starter for the Montreal Canadiens, right? He's actually like he's much better than anyone thought. Florida had kind of written him off and put him on waivers, and he came up and even in an injury riddled season, he had a great season, and now he's kind of taken that. So when whoever the goalie for a cup contending Canadians team is going to be shows up in Montreal, Samuel Montembeault is going to be that veteran for them. Currently, I feel like there's somebody like David Savard who, whether or not, he's a shot blocker. So obviously there's some old school GMs that love that kind of guy when they're heading into the playoffs. The Canadians didn't trade him away because they feel that he has been great in terms of mentorship, in terms of setting an example, in terms of work ethic, right? And then you've got Mike Matheson, who had a wonderful, like a phenomenal year for the Montreal Canadiens and himself in terms of producing points and all of that. He was obviously overworked. He's also somebody that I think the Canadians will want to keep around because of that veteran support. Whereas up front, I have a lot more question marks, right? Because you've got a lot of turnover. You've got people who've had kind of a surprisingly good season, like Yoel Armia, right? Like I feel like I could consider him a veteran, but talent-wise, it's not really necessarily there, right? Like the talent is all in the young guys, the elite talent, or the not, the potential for elite talent. Like when I talk about this, I don't think they're Austin Matthews good. I just mean the best talent on the team. Like I feel like there was somebody, for example, somebody like Sean Monahan that they traded to Winnipeg. They brought him back on a 1-year contract because of the effect that he had on the team, because of how versatile he was, right? Like you could plug him anywhere and he was still producing. He was still able to create plays and stuff like that, even though he was very injury prone and he is getting on the into the twilight of his career, right? So I feel like other than that, though, in terms of veterans, like you've got Brendan Gallagher. I don't really know if I want Brendan Gallagher setting an example.
Yeah, I wouldn't. If it was up to me, I wouldn't.
Right. And then you've got Josh Anderson, who, for all intents and purposes, is a veteran because everybody else is a child, right?
Hmm.
But he's also had such a terrible season that his interview at the end of the season, like his, the locker room clean out day interview, he was so down on himself. And I don't necessarily know if, playing wise or mentality wise, like right now is the best time for him to be mentoring people. But I did kind of appreciate that the Montreal Canadiens rely a lot on Nick Suzuki to be the adult in the room, even though he is one of the youngest players. And he's stepped up his game, right? Like he always takes the younger players under his wing. He hypes them up in the media. He advocates for them to his coach. He's very much like, and I don't think it's a coincidence that the Montreal Canadiens, when Logan Mailloux arrived in Laval, a lot of the time prior to the season, they had him spend a lot of time with Nick Suzuki, right? Like they'd given him a lot of homework. And I know part of it is optics as well. Like I do have that cynicism, and I understand that putting, our nice boy Nick Suzuki, who cannot get anything wrong, next to Logan Mailloux is kind of, there is a little bit of marketing in that strategy as well. But I also think that it was quite calculated in that, this is the kind of person that you should be spending time with, not some other guy that's gonna, that's partying or like not necessarily known for his quote unquote leadership skills. So I think in terms of veteran support, like I don't know that there's anybody that I would trust to remain on this roster when they're starting to get better. But for now, like I feel like defense wise, they've got it good, but Sean Monahan would have left maybe a void. Like there should have
Hmm.
been a Paul Byron type person still here. And incidentally, Paul Byron is apparently going to be coaching in Laval or assistant coaching in
Oh
Laval.
wow.
That's just something I found out today. But that is he's an Ottawa boy.
Yeah.
That is, it's a great, if that happens, that is great for the Montreal's young prospects in Laval. But like he was somebody that I feel like had a lot of he had a lot of leadership skills, and he was also the kind of guy that would always play really intelligently, and he would always play tough. And I think that that's kind of, you have a mix of your young talent, and you've got that like old school guy that every GM likes. You put them together, and like I think Paul Byron was very good at mentorship and development.
I like that you mentioned Sam Montembeault because I wanted to bring him up as an example of something that I'm jealous of the Habs for is that goaltending was the biggest problem for the Sens this year. I would go as far to say that if the Sens had Sam Montembeault as their starter this year, they would have been close to the playoffs because ever since Jacques Martin took over, um, our like expected goals against was very good. It was in the top half of the league, but both of our goalies, I believe, finished with an 890 save percentage, and you just can't have that. I think that was the worst average in the whole league across the goalie tandems.
Oh
So
God.
and then I was always seeing Sam Montembeault making like 35 saves every night for the Habs, like win or lose, you know. So
Mhm.
I'm jealous of him. I think the Habs have got a good one in net there.
Yeah, and he's also like I think one of the reasons like I like him is his attitude, right? Like he's a cherub basically. He's got rosy cheeks, he likes snacks, he's very articulate with the media. Like he's also one of the only few players that speak French, right? So I like listening to his
Hmm.
French interviews and they're so entertaining because most of the time you have a guy who speaks English mostly trying to put together a sentence in French.
Yeah,
It's
broken grammar and stuff. I bet.
yeah, it's like even Kent Hughes. I always joke that like when people say like, "Do you speak French?" I'm like, "Yes, I speak French exactly like Kent Hughes does."
Nice.
But yeah, so I think there's a lot of reason for optimism on that front, and also like just any time you have Martin Saint Louis in your organization, I feel like you can't go wrong. I have a lot of
Hmm.
questions about him tactically, but in terms of inspiring and in terms of like the actual day-to-day development of the players, he's done a really, really fantastic job so far.
Yeah, it must be nice to have a coach that you're just expecting to be here for a while, right? Like, who knows with rebuilds, a lot of the time coaches get replaced by the end of them if they're unable to take the team to the next step, like we saw with DJ Smith. But at least for now, it's like, all right, we're locked in with Marty St. Louis, which must be nice because once again, the Sens are searching for a coach.
I'll do it. I can't promise you I'll be good at it or I won't purposely suck at it. Because
Sabotage.
sabotage, because these teams are rivals, and we're going to talk about what's next and if they actually have a rivalry or if it's just a one-sided ass kicking. That's coming up in just one moment. But first, this episode is also brought to you by Monopoly Go. And I'm going to go ahead and admit it. I have a terrible competitive side. I can be really, really annoying. And my competitive side is a big fan of Monopoly Go. I'm sure you've heard of it because it's been downloaded over 150 million times. It is a great twist on Monopoly where you play on not one, but hundreds of Monopoly boards in crazy locations, building up amazing cities that bring you big money. But the best part of it is messing with my friends. Like I said, I'm competitive and annoying. I charge my friends rent on my iconic properties just like classic Monopoly. But now I can also heist their vaults for riches for myself. And the leaderboards show me who the biggest Monopoly tycoon is, and you can bet I will be throwing a tantrum if I'm not up there. But it's not just my competitive side that loves it. You can also team up with friends and people all around the world in time tournaments to earn huge rewards. So get into the game and join your friends. Download Monopoly Go now free on the App Store or Google Play. All right, we are back and we're going to talk about I want to talk about the future a little bit, but I want to get a couple things out of the way. So,
Hmm.
I have historically really not liked Ottawa like as a
Yeah.
team, right? I like going to Ottawa, I like seeing my friends in Ottawa. I do not like the Ottawa Senators. And they take one of my favorite players of all time, Claude Giroux, becomes an Ottawa Senator. He is now dead to
Oh,
me. He is
oh
now
no.
completely dead to me. And like I could never like imagine not liking Daniel Alfredson, but he was an Ottawa Senator, so to me, no. But I think in recent years, it's kind of felt like, especially when you're two teams that don't really make the playoffs, right? Like it used to be for me, the Bruins were the team I hated the most in the world. And then it became the Leafs are the team I hated the most in the world. Like Ottawa has just always been a low grade, constant hate. um, and I don't think that like the on ice product really helps because there was a period of time where Montreal was constantly beating Ottawa, and then it just flipped. And I feel like Montreal has not beat Ottawa in like a year or 2 years or something like that, 18 months. I have no idea.
Yeah, I think it's like the Sens are 9-0 or something in the
Yeah.
last 2 seasons against the Habs, which is just ridiculous, especially because I feel like most of the time the games are close. But the Sens just managed to pull it off in the end. Like that last game near to the end of the season, I was actually rooting for the Habs to win that one just because I wanted to slip below you guys in the draft lottery odds. But it didn't work out because for once the Sens actually scored with their goalie pulled. Usually they don't ever do that. You guys saw like an absolute rarity, an absolute miracle in that game that we actually tied it with the goalie pulled. But yeah, I'll say like. I kind of liked the Habs as a kid. They went on some fairly deep playoff runs when I was younger, but then it all instantly stopped as soon as the Sens and Habs met in the playoffs for the first time, and then I instantly hated them. And it's just I think I feel like right now it's more of a rivalry between the fan bases and less so with the teams.
Yeah.
But also like I don't know if you've seen that meme where it's like a fake Wikipedia article that says the Battle of Mid. That's just Sens and Habs fan arguing is just that because it's arguing over who is like the sixth best team in the Atlantic Division. You know, like it's not really much bragging rights for who's better. So I'm really excited though because those playoff series between Ottawa and Montreal are some of my best hockey memories growing up. So when these two teams do eventually get back into the playoffs, I'm really excited to get some more intense series, and that's when the rivalry is really going to heat up again.
And okay, so here's my question.
Hmm.
We talked about it earlier. I went to Real Sports and I watched a playoff game between the Habs, between the Leafs and the Bruins. Sorry, this was this past Monday. The Bruins ended up winning that one, and I was there the whole time, and I could not figure out which team I hated more. I feel like those are the two teams I hate the most, and I was angry at every goal. You know, I was angry at the end. There was nothing redeeming about either of those teams. So do you feel as strongly about the Habs as you do about the Leafs?
So the only reason this is like the tipping point. The reason why I'll say no is because of the Leafs and Habs playoff series in the bubble, or not in the bubble, but in the COVID year.
Yeah.
I was rooting for the Habs because it is way funnier when the Leafs lose
It was
than it.
3-1, by the way. Just
Yeah,
don't forget that.
exactly. I was so happy when they made that comeback because it was the most unexpected thing ever. Like we had the meme of like, oh, Toronto can't get out of the first round forever, and then it looked like they were finally going to do it, and so it was just the funniest possible outcome. So like as soon as that series ended, I was like, okay, I want the Habs to lose in the next round, and then when they went to the finals, like I was kind of butthurt about that. I was like, oh, they're not that good. I think they've gotten lucky, you know, but I was fully rooting for them to beat the Leafs. So I do have to say that I hate the Leafs more than the Habs for sure.
I also think so. All right, so real quick, let's turn our attention to the future. What do you think is in the immediate future of these two teams?
Hmm. I'll start with the Habs. Like I think it's probably I don't know what you think for their future outlook, but it's probably not going to be playoffs within the next 2 years or so. But I would expect them to start getting a lot closer, especially if Lane Hudson can have like a huge rookie year next year. I think that could have a huge impact. And if you keep getting consistent goaltending as well, that's huge. I would expect to see them like getting farther away from the top five draft pick every year, getting closer into that like 10 and 15 range of starting to compete for a playoff spot. And then the Sens, I'm a little bit less optimistic where I think they're just going to be like if I had to call it, I'd say they probably miss the playoffs again next year unless they get like the perfect coaching fit, a coach that can just like take them way farther than they should and make them like greater than the sum of their parts. Because from a roster moves perspective, I really don't know what can be done this summer, especially with the goaltending being locked into Eunice Corpusalo for another 4 years is really rough. It's hard to bring in another starting goaltender when you have that contract with you. And in terms of upgrading the defense, maybe we can bring in a right-handed D in free agency, which would be good. But then you also have the Jacob Chikrin question where he's 1 year left on his contract. Don't know if he's going to be signed or traded. So if you have to trade him, you're going to be wanting to get like solid NHLers back in that deal. Like kind of, you probably would be looking for a hockey trade, right? Get a similar asset who can help us right now. But I don't know if that's going to be possible. It might just be teams offering only futures, right? Because when we got him, it was only draft picks and we didn't give up any players at all. And teams might be offering similar packages to that. So I don't know. I think it's going to be hard for the Sens to take a big step next year. I think I would probably expect them to be out of the playoffs again, but hopefully the offseason gives me a bit more hope.
I did want to get into that real quick, but I wanted to ask if I could interest you in a gently used Josh Anderson. I know he's not a
No,
defenseman.
no, thank you, no,
Not an
thank you.
RD, but I tried. But
I remember in that last Sens and Habs game of the season, I think it was Gary Galley. He said something like, "You wouldn't believe how few goals Josh Anderson has this season." And I'm like, "Really? You wouldn't believe that? Like, what is kind of expected at this point?"
we've had some fun episodes where Scott has asked me to, guess how many goals or guess what his like expected goals for was. And I
Oh
think at one
God.
point I was like, oh, it can't be that bad. And he was like, it was like 16 or something, like
Oh,
16%.
oh.
Yes, that it is unfortunate. We love Josh Anderson. He's very beautiful to look at, but unfortunately his hockey was not so beautiful to watch. For me, I'm expecting a little bit better drafting from the Ottawa Senators this year, given that they have changed their I believe have they fired all of their scouting staff, or just the head scout, or just the scouting consultant?
So the pro scouts got
Right.
got moved on from the amateur scouts. I'm actually not sure. I can't remember
Okay.
off the top of my head, but I agree. I would expect better drafting overall.
Yeah, that's what I'm expecting. So that's a hopeful thing. In terms of, with the Montreal Canadiens, I think you're right. I feel like they're about 2 years away from making the playoffs. I think it's good for them to have that goal, and for every player to try and take a step forward in service of that goal. But I don't think they're going to get there, particularly in this weird division and the wild card. I mean, we saw the wild card went down to the wire this past season, right? So there's Detroit that's still hungry. There's Buffalo that really needs to make a step forward. There's Ottawa that's still hungry. So I feel like with Ottawa, very much like you said, it's really going to depend on what coaching situation works out for them, and if that can happen. But I feel like at this point they're going upwards enough in my mind next year that the rivalry will be a bit more intense and a little bit more fun.
Hmm. I think so too. Both teams should be moving in the right direction. We don't know if Ottawa will move in the right direction because we've been saying it for like 3 years now, but in theory, hopefully. And then that's just gonna make the rivalry even more heated.
I think so. And that's the thing, is like with Montreal too, like I feel like it's less bad decisions and it's more, or no decisions, and it's more like injuries that have come up and things that have happened.
Right.
Like I feel
Hmm.
very confident in this front office group right now. I feel confident in the development staff. I don't feel confident in the injuries. We've been burned. It's been 3 years in a row of them having either the worst man game total or the second worst, or so I'm hoping that it picks up. In the meantime, there'll be so much hockey to watch. And so tell us, where can people find you and how can people find your content?
So I'm on Twitter a lot. We've got my handle on the screen there, Mod Show, and of course, Game Over Ottawa will be relaunching. We're probably going to have at least some off-season coverage, which we didn't have before. So that'll be fun to do a bit of draft coverage potentially, and like free agency if there's any trades as well. But then the sort of official relaunch is going to be obviously in October for next season when the Sens are playing again. And I do have a podcast on the side as well called Extra Attackers. You can find that in my Twitter bio as well. It's on kind of on hiatus right now, but there's a nice catalog of past episodes as well too. And it'll come back in the future, so you can subscribe over there as well.
That's awesome. And in the meantime, you can find our podcast wherever you get your podcasts, as well as on YouTube. You can find us on Twitter at LO_Canadians. Scott and I are both on social media. I'm at The Active Stick. He is at Scott Matla. I thank you so much for listening. Our mailbag has been moved because we had a special guest. It has been moved to next Monday. And both Scott and I will be back, and we will see you then.